Greetings from CBC Studio A to our tens of listeners from coast to coast, and welcome to another episode of Discernment Digest, where we seek to help you think better about less by applying precepts and principles of God's truth to the affairs of everyday life. And we also look at contemporary events from a biblical perspective in an effort to model discernment in how we assess what's happening. This past week saw two events that should engender good feelings, and I think for most of us, they have. First, the United States men's national soccer team made it to the round of 16 teams in the World Cup that's being hosted by our country after winning its third game in the tournament, this time defeating Bosnia-Herzegovina 2-0 this past Wednesday. Now, we've played 4 games so far, and our record then is 3-1, and we play again the day that this podcast is going to be posted on Monday, July the 6th. There are something like 5 to 7 days between each match, as the tournament started nearly a month ago, and yet we played only 4 times. Now, that's true of U.S. football, too. You know, our sport with the word foot in it. Even though, as Nate Bargatze has made famous, it's played with a ball that you throw with your hands, and there's just a little kicking. But our football is full-on contact, and serious injuries are a reality every week, so much so that the average career of an NFL player is not very long, with one well-traveled statistic from the NFL Players Association saying that the average career is just 3.5 years. Now, what the rest of the world calls football, we call soccer. Certainly, it has contact and genuine injuries, but most of you have seen the memes of soccer players embellishing their injuries, writhing on the field for several minutes only to pop up and play on. Several years ago, ESPN did a parody of it showing guys in their office. So some of the sportscasters on ESPN, they're at their cubicles in their offices in their regular office attire. But then they've got a guy coming in dressed like a soccer player, and they bump into him in the hallway, and he falls down on the floor, and he's writhing in pain for no reason, and he's just whining as if he's dying. So that's kind of a known thing, and it's something that soccer is made fun of, at least by many of us here in the U.S. Now, let me take a further minute to make fun of soccer, even though I've come to realize it's the most popular sport literally in the world, and I admit that I am enjoying the World Cup for the most part. I could do without the fake injuries, but I'll poke a little bit of fun of it. I read something about how to fix soccer and make it better. Somebody said, look, the field is much too huge, so shrink the field. There are too many players on the field. Limit to 3 forwards, 2 defenders, and a goalie. The players should get to come in and out whenever they want. Don't stop the game. Shrink the goal and have ice everywhere. Now, I got to say, as someone who played hockey for about 10 years as a kid, I continued playing organized floor hockey as a young adult, and it's still my favorite sport. If a hockey player became known for faking and embellishing, he would be given a beatdown so that he had something very real to cry about. And with watching the soccer in the World Cup, they do have these weird rules, the offside thing. I've read a lot of people complaining about that. I'm complaining about it as well. The yellow cards and the red cards, but maybe the worst part of it to me is the way time is kept. And I have no idea when the game is ending. And the fact that the clock just continues to run no matter what is happening. And the players just seem to take their time bringing the ball from, throwing it in from out of bounds, doing the corner kick, goal kick, whatever the case may be. Nobody seems to be in much of a hurry. And, time runs out, you lose the game. So I don't understand any of that. Certainly in hockey, it's not like that. Football, it's not like that. But I haven't been a soccer fan because when I was a kid, a zillion years ago, soccer was just not a thing. It was not a thing in the United States at all. When I was a kid, we didn't play it. We played hockey, we played Little League baseball, all of those kinds of things. No soccer. But it happened that, as God would have it, I was enrolled starting in 8th grade in Intercity Baptist School, and it turned out that the guys that had been in that school from kindergarten on up, who are now my classmates, they had all played soccer for all those years in elementary school. Intercity had soccer. My school, my public school, elementary school, did not have it. Almost nobody had it, but they did. I came to find out that I think it was because these relatively small Christian schools couldn't afford to have a soccer field, a soccer stadium, all of that. And so they had, a football field. They couldn't afford that, so they had soccer instead. So you had these small Christian schools playing soccer against each other, but that was really about it. But the U.S. hosting the World Cup is indeed great, and our team's advancing is great. So that's one of the two things this week that should make us all feel good. I meant to mention, sorry about Intercity, that they are so good that they have won 7 state soccer championships. So they've been playing it for a lot of decades now and doing quite well overall. Now, the other thing that should, and I think has, made most of us feel pretty good this week is the celebration of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Our second and third presidents were each signatories to the Declaration, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And some of you may know that they died on the same day, in fact, within 6 hours of each other, but it was on July 4th. It was July 4th, 1826, and so it was the 50th anniversary of the Declaration that our second and third presidents died just hours apart. Now, the celebration of America at 250 years did have many joyful moments, and I hope you were all able to observe that event with family and friends, and that you took time to thank the Lord for the greatest nation in the history of the world. Now, that all being said and being true, and it is, I'm going to point out some less than great facts about the semiquincentennial, which unfortunately took some of the luster off. Now, I'm pointing these out not to be unnecessarily negative, but to set the stage for the next portion of today's episode that's going to deal with the separation of powers, or the lack thereof that we have these days, and this past week's Supreme Court decisions that affect those separations. It's somewhat surprising, and it's definitely disappointing, that this special 250th July 4th celebration did not go much better than it did, but it seems to have been botched in a few ways. One is by America 250 versus Freedom 250. Don't know if you've heard of that, but America 250 was created by Congress to plan this 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration in 2016. So 10 years in advance, Congress created a bipartisan commission called the U.S. Semiquincentennial Commission to plan the 2026 celebration. And America250.org is a 501c3 nonprofit that supports the commission. There are nonpartisan leaders who sit on its board, and there's a group of about 30 bipartisan lawmakers who make up the commission. For years, the organization planned programming for what would have been seen for these last several weeks. But shortly after President Trump came back into office in 2025, he signed an executive order that created Task Force 250 as an additional 250th anniversary planning group. Trump named himself as the chair and Vice President J.D. Vance as the vice chair. This task force was part of the Department of Defense. And as part of the so-called Big Beautiful Bill passed in July of last year, Big Beautiful Bill is what the president called it, Congress appropriated $150 million in funding for the 250th anniversary celebration. While the law said this money was to be distributed by the Interior Department, it did not specify that it would go to America 250, but that was the assumption since Freedom 250 did not even exist at the time. But this past December, President Trump announced Freedom 250 in a social media video. Now, Freedom 250 does not have to disclose its donors, and so we don't really know what private individuals or organizations funded it. Anyway, it's been Freedom 250 that put on events like the UFC fight at the White House a couple weeks ago, and the Great American State Fair. Now, I guess for UFC fans, that event was considered to be a success. But did you see the attendance at the Great American State Fair? The idea seems like a good one to me. We all love state fairs, and that is a real part of Americana. And so whoever came up with that idea, kudos to them. However, the execution of it seems to have just been horrible. Last month, President Trump posted on social media that he would be very involved in the July 4th celebrations that would be put on by Freedom 250. And he said it would be the, quote, most spectacular Trump rally of them all. And the taxpayer money allocated by Congress that was supposed to go to America 250 is instead, much of it, going to Freedom 250. Now, that Trump rally emphasis and a more partisan rather than bipartisan approach adversely affected the state fair. There was supposed to be a concert series associated with it, but in May, many of the artists who were set to perform dropped out due to the partisanship. Martina McBride said she, quote, asked lots of questions and was assured this was a nonpartisan event that was meant to celebrate all 50 states, end quote. When she was told that it was, quote, in fact, that was not what was happening, end quote, she dropped out. And then there is the reflecting pool on the National Mall in D.C., located between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial, that was supposed to be cleaned up and the pool lined with an American flag blue color. But the work was given in a no-bid contract to an associate of the president, a longtime Trump donor, supporter, and his Palm Beach, Florida neighbor. And it did not go well, as the algae in the reflecting pool that has, to be fair, been a problem for many years, but it was supposed to be cleaned up. It's still there. And paint has either peeled off the pool or it's been sabotaged or both. This past week, a man was arrested and charged with vandalizing the pool by Jeanine Pirro, that would be Judge Jeanine, on television, but it appears the problems are much more extensive than what one person could do, and it's not at all clear that this man did anything that resulted in the problems at the pool. It will be very, very interesting to see whether the problems at that pool are indeed due to some kind of foul play or whether it was in fact due to shoddy workmanship. That neither the state fair nor the pool renovations went well is too bad, as both were, I think, good ideas with, as I said, just very poor execution, it appears. Now, some of you are old enough that, like me, you can remember our country's bicentennial celebration 50 years ago in 1976. I can recall as a teenager feeling a sense of swelling pride during that year's commemoration. And it happened to be the year of the Quadrennial Olympic Games in 1976 held in Montreal. Now, back then, the Summer and Winter Olympics took place in the same year every 4 years, so we were treated to our athletes doing extremely well in both, including Bruce Jenner winning the decathlon, making him the world's greatest athlete. Now, unfortunately, you all know Bruce became Caitlyn, and the rest is sordid history. But both of those, the bicentennial and the Olympics, served the political party in power very well, as anytime the country has a good feeling about itself, it redounds to the benefit of the party in power. And the Republicans had the White House with Gerald Ford as our president. Now, you may recall the circumstances in which he became president. They were awful. President Nixon had to resign in disgrace in August of '74 due to his proven involvement in Watergate and its cover-up. Just 10 months before Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew had resigned in disgrace as well because he was being charged with bribery, extortion, and tax fraud during his time as governor of Maryland before he became vice president. Now, he pleaded no contest to a lesser charge, but he agreed to step down. 2 months later, and just 8 months before Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford was appointed by Nixon to succeed Agnew as vice president. It meant that when Nixon left office, Ford became president. But he did so with the country demoralized and his party, the Republicans, in shambles. The conventional and understandable wisdom was that there was no way that in just 2 years Ford would have any shot whatsoever at remaining in the White House. But due, in part, to that national pride which the Olympics and bicentennial celebration generated, Joe Ford came close to beating Jimmy Carter in November of '76, much closer than most predicted. Now, though 2026 is not a presidential election year like '76 was, it is an election year, what are called the off-year elections, elections for other than president. Now remember, every 2 years, the entire 435 members of the House of Representatives runs for office because they serve only 2-year terms. And of the 100 senators, 2 from each of the 50 states, every 2 years, 33 or 34 are up for re-election to a 6-year term. So that will be the case this year, and the party in the White House in most off-year elections usually does not fare well. So in the best case, Republicans were looking at losing seats in both the House and Senate, and the Democrats ending up in control of both in all likelihood. Now, the Republicans control both houses of Congress now, but only by slim margins. But had the 250-year celebration gone better, that, coupled with the pride of the U.S. in the World Cup, it could have perhaps saved the Senate for Republicans. But now all bets are off, and it doesn't appear the president really cares that much about the elections, given that he himself is a lame duck. That is, he cannot be elected to a third term in 2028, as presidents can serve only 2. Now, I mentioned this past week's Supreme Court decisions, and I'm going to spend our remaining time on those. I have talked a number of times on Discernment Digest about the beauty of our Constitution due to the framework that it set up to keep power from being concentrated in one area of government, and especially from being concentrated in one person. Of all the concerns of our founders, above all, they wanted to avoid allowing the president to become a king. Now remember, the Declaration of Independence was a split with England, but in particular, it was a rebellion against the British monarch, King George III. The Declaration detailed the king's many abuses as the basis for the severing of the relationship. Now, as I thought about these matters anew this week, my mind went back to one of my most important educational sources. I speak, of course, of Schoolhouse Rock. Some of you remember the iconic Schoolhouse Rock songs that aired on Saturday mornings in the mid-'70s when kids all across America were watching the weekly cartoons. So that was the set time to get just a few hours in a row of cartoons for kids. This was before the videos and internet and so on. They set to music and to graphics lessons on government and grammar and other subjects. So some of you might remember about how a bill becomes a law. I'm a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. That's what I remember of it. And it described the process of a bill introduced in Congress, then proceeding to become a law. Well, in 1975, the year before America's 200th birthday, they put out No More Kings, the lyrics of which included, "They wanted no more Mother England. They knew the time had come for them to take command. It's very clear you're being unfair, King. No matter what you say, we won't obey. Gonna hold a revolution now, King, and we're gonna run it all our way. With no more kings, we're gonna elect a president. No more kings. He's gonna do what the people want. No more kings. We're gonna run things our way. No more kings. Nobody's gonna tell us what to do." Now, as evidenced by the deliberations of James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay in the Federalist Papers, portions of which I've read here in the past, they were indeed greatly concerned to avoid creating any kind of monarchy in this new nation. And so the Constitution was framed with separation of powers between the 3 branches of our government, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. Now notice the order. Article 1 of our Constitution is devoted to the legislative branch, those who make the laws, legislate, that is, Congress, the House and the Senate. They set it up so that the two houses of Congress have their own prerogatives. While bills that would become law can originate in either the House or the Senate, those that would raise revenue can only originate in the House. But it's the Senate that must approve presidential appointments of what the Constitution calls principal officers, like cabinet members, but many others as well. And it is only the Senate which must approve treaties that the United States signs with other nations. An impeachment of a federal officeholder, including the president, must come from the House of Representatives, but be tried and affirmed by a two-thirds vote of the 100 senators. That would be 67 votes. Such a high threshold is why we have never in our history had an impeached president actually convicted by the Senate and removed. The president's powers were designed to have limitations, as he's to be limited to money that Congress appropriates to him and his agencies. He's not allowed to accept what the Constitution calls emoluments, that is, gifts from foreign governments to benefit himself. He's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but it's Congress alone that has the power to declare war. So you see some of that checks and balances that the founders baked into our Constitution. And that's just some of them. Now, the legislative and executive branches are the political branches. That is, those who serve in Congress and as president are elected by the people. But the third branch, the judicial, is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and the judges have life tenure in order to insulate them from political pressure, including the threat of a president to remove them if he doesn't like what they do. Now, I've said in previous episodes that the power of the presidency has been increasing in recent years as presidents of both parties have tested their constitutional limits. President Obama, for instance, frustrated by lack of cooperation by the Republicans in Congress, said infamously in 2014, quote, "I have a pen and a phone, and I will use both," end quote. The pen represented his authority to sign executive orders and administrative actions. The phone represented his power to convene outside groups, business leaders, and citizens to rally support for his agenda. He was saying, in effect, that he could bypass Congress if need be, and if he could make it work. Now, Biden did that as well, with, for example, his executive order forgiving hundreds of billions in student loans. The court later overturned that as an overreach of his power. President Trump, in his first term and now, especially in his second, when he has no personal political concerns since he cannot run again, he has really, really tested the limits with the imposition of tariffs, with deploying the National Guard to U.S. cities, with an executive order banning birthright citizenship, and with firing federal employees. Now, I'll review those in a moment, but they're a story this past week because June 30 traditionally ends the Supreme Court's term, which starts the first Monday in October. So from early October until the end of June, they hear cases, they decide, they write opinions, and they publicly release those from time to time during the term. But there are always several that come out in the final month of June, and often some important ones come out on the very last day. And that was the case this past Tuesday, June the 30th. Back in February, the court struck down the president's attempts to enact new tariffs on America's trading partners because that's a power the Constitution gives to Congress. In December, the court blocked the president from deploying National Guard soldiers to Chicago in order to enforce immigration law and control crime, because federal troops are not to be used against American citizens, something that reminds of British troops storming their way into the then colonies. This week, the president suffered a big loss again from the court, though he also had a very big win, too, that I'll mention in a bit. But the loss was in that birthright citizenship case where The president had sought to, by executive order, say that children born in the U.S. to non-citizens are not themselves citizens. Now, it seems strange, but the 14th Amendment to our Constitution has been interpreted by the courts for over 125 years to say that any child born on U.S. soil, no matter to whom, with a very few exceptions like children of foreign diplomats, then those children are, in fact, U.S. citizens. Now, you can see how this would be a problem, especially when you have companies in China, for instance, who engage in what's called birth tourism. They bring pregnant women over as tourists who then have babies here, go back home, but those babies are U.S. citizens for life. And anecdotally, I know that similar things happen because in my neck of the woods in the Detroit area, a friend of mine spent decades working in the labor and delivery area of the largest hospital in Dearborn, Michigan, where we have a very, very large community of residents from the Middle East. She tells me it was not uncommon for pregnant relatives to visit, have the baby here, and head back. So it's an issue, and a weird one, as the 14th Amendment is worded in a way that it could have been, and some thought would be, interpreted by the justices as containing language that did not foresee things like birth tourism. And so the 14th Amendment, then, they had hoped the justices would say, is not applicable to what the president was trying to curtail. So I don't fault the president for trying, but I do fault him and his administration for the way they tried. He issued a blanket prohibition that allowed for no exceptions. And given that weird wording in the 14th Amendment, it says this: all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Now, that subject to the jurisdiction thereof language is puzzling, but it's been interpreted by the court a few times going back to 1898. And each time the court ruled that any child born on our soil falls under that clause and therefore is a citizen. So the Trump folks had an uphill climb to overturn 125 years of precedent, which meant they should have focused more narrowly and directly on things like birth tourism, rather than an outright ban on all children born to any non-citizen. Now, it may well be good policy to bar all non-citizen children from becoming citizens, but if the Constitution allows it, as has been the case for over a century, then issuing a presidential executive order cannot overturn it. Instead, it requires a constitutional amendment, or, since that is almost impossible, some other things that could be done. In fact, let me read from an article this past week by conservative columnist Ramesh Ponnuru. He said the U.S. has not only historically been able to deter illegal immigration while following the birthright citizenship rule, it's doing it right now. President Donald Trump's success in controlling the southern border is proof that he does not need to prevail on birthright citizenship in order to crack down on illegal immigration. And the government could do much more to shrink the current illegal population over time, such as requiring employers to verify the legal status of new hires. It might not even take a new act of Congress for a president to implement that policy. Nor has, he says, birthright citizenship stopped the Trump administration from boasting of its successes in fighting things like birth tourism. Applying for and securing a visa solely for the purpose of garnering U.S. citizenship for a child is both an act of fraud and its grounds for inadmissibility. In fact, Senator John Cornyn from Texas has introduced legislation to stiffen enforcement of laws against that practice. Penalties would be tougher. Removal of those involved in facilitating birth tourism would be expedited. Countries refusing to work with the United States on the issue would face restrictions on visas for their own residents. So again, with this decision, nothing new happened with this case. It kept in place the status quo of over 125 years. But to hear some talk, it's the end of the republic. Here's Matt Walsh, who's a writer for Ben Shapiro's news site, The Daily Wire. He said, I at least got to live for 40 years in a country that looks and functions something like America. The fact that my children are having that opportunity stolen from them fills me with rage so deep I can't describe it. But worse, a guy named Sean Davis, who is the CEO of the conservative media outlet The Federalist, he said this about what needs to be done to fight back against the ruling. Now, hang on, as I get into it, it gets a little wild. He says several ways forward, given the choice of John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett to nullify the 14th Amendment and extra constitutionally replace it with their own language. Let me just stop there. That's false. The 14th Amendment has been law for, as I said, over 100 years. Anyway, here are some of the ways he says that actions that can be taken to overcome it. He says nullification. States issue birth certificates, and they can just stop issuing them to non-citizens. Roberts and Barrett can deal with the fallout and litigate each birth individually. Secondly, we could pack the court, he says. If Roberts wants to be a politician who writes laws instead of a judge, then he can fight with 10 more unelected legislators in robes. Third, we can deny entry to all pregnant foreigners. Or fourth, we can deny entry to all female foreigners. Or fifth, we can require sterilization of all foreign visitors prior to entry. Sixth, we can dissolve the Union. A nation which can't even restrict who gets to be a citizen isn't a nation. Seventh and last, amend the Constitution. This is pointless because once a judge decides he can rewrite the Constitution at will, as he claims Roberts and Barrett did, the actual text is meaningless. But this is what most Republican politicians gravitate towards because they are useless. And if you think all of these options are not great, understand that this is what happens, he says, when unelected judges decide that they're in charge of the country and they get to write its laws. Okay, well, another guy, Eric Metaxas, was so mad at the court that he said this: the, quote, in quotes, legal reasoning for their, in quotes, decision must, all caps, be demanded. We'll wait, he says. The legal reasoning for their decision must be demanded. We'll wait, says Eric Metaxas. Does this guy not know that every Supreme Court decision has their reasoning in writing in their opinions, majority opinion, dissenting opinions, concurring opinions? This is a guy who's written somewhat acclaimed biographies of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther in the past, but someone like Tucker Carlson, he seems to have lost his marbles in the last few years. You may recall me saying that he claimed that there was a dark cloud that hovered over the Biden White House, which Eric confidently said was a demonic presence. Well, now here he is demanding that justices explain their reasoning, but as I said, they always do that. They write and release opinions that anyone can read for themselves. Explaining their reasoning is what they do. And they've been doing for over 200 years with every decision and dissent available in the public record. Now, the decision was 5-4 with the 3 Democrat-appointed justices, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, being joined by Chief Justice John Roberts and Trump appointee Amy Coney Barrett. Now, bear in mind that even the other 4 justices who voted against the ruling, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Thomas, none of them said that no child born of non-citizens are citizens, but instead they wrote that exceptions could be carved out. But that is precisely why the president should have, as I said earlier, written his executive order that way in the first place. Anyway, while both Roberts and Barrett were viciously criticized by the hardcore right-wing commentariat, Amy Coney Barrett was especially maligned because, now get this, they claim she was biased because toward foreign babies because she and her husband have adopted 2 Haitian children. Now, mind you, just a couple of weeks ago, Justice Barrett voted with the majority of the court to allow President Trump to end something called temporary protected status for approximately 350,000 immigrants from Now, wait for it, from Haiti, the very country from which she and her husband adopted those two children. Here's the truth of the matter. Good justices do not always vote the way they want. Sometimes the Constitution is written in a way that it ends up in a result that they don't like. And the most clear example is the late Antonin Scalia voting to uphold the right, because of freedom of speech, to burn the American flag. And that's a guy who absolutely detests the burning of the American flag, and he said so in his written opinion, but the law and the Constitution allowed it, he believed. Therefore, he was obligated to vote that way. And that's what justices do sometimes. People who don't understand our system and think that justices are politicians who are outcome-oriented, they then can judge whether or not those justices are doing a good job simply by the result. But sometimes the result is not what we want, but the reasoning is exactly as it should be. I'm thankful that the court is playing its assigned role in keeping power from being concentrated in either political branch in violation of the Constitution's checks and balances structure. In the words of Sarah Isger's book on the court, the title is The Last Branch Standing. But the court gave the president a huge win on the last day of its term also, ruling that he can fire employees of agencies that do their work with the executive branch because he's the chief executive, so all who are in the executive branch work for him. Now, that may seem obvious, but as Justice Gorsuch pointed it out in his opinion that concurred with the majority, but he, in his concurring opinion, issued some concerns. He said, the president does have this power, but he also said that many of these agencies were created by Congress, and Congress had no thought that in doing that, they would be enhancing the power of the president. Some of these agencies, in fact, do quasi-legislative work and even some judicial work, and so granting the president full power over these creates an imbalance that may not have been intended and may well not be good, he suggested. But for now, the power of the presidency has been greatly enhanced, as this has added to the near full immunity from prosecution that the court gave the president last year. So we don't have a king, but the presidency has certainly become more powerful of late. If you have any questions or comments, you can send those to discern@cbctrenton.com. I hope you can listen again next Monday. In the meantime, have a great week serving and discerning.